Hi, everybody. I'm Paul Yeager. This is the MTOM podcast, a production of Iowa PBS and the Market to Market TV show. We're talking to a friend of the show that we've had on a couple of times. It's Andrey Sizov. He is based in Europe. He gives us a great perspective of Russia and Ukraine and a lot to do with the wheat market. We had this conversation just a couple of weeks ago, right after a WASD report. So early to mid-February. So if a couple of things have changed, just be warned, that's when we recorded it. But we know a couple of things probably aren't going to change, and that is the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine and the United States and China and having the discussions there. So Andrey, why we talked to him is he is the publisher and he watches a lot about the Black Sea, focuses very heavily on wheat. He has a report that comes out. It's market research. It's the Sizov Report. And so we always like to kind of get his take on what's happening, what has changed. We're going to kind of jump around the globe a little bit. We will talk about India and Pakistan just briefly at the end. We'll also get into Brazil. We don't get into Argentina in this one, but we will talk about China and the U.S., as well as some European issues that are going on with Russia and Ukraine. So that is what's ahead in this installment of the podcast. New episodes come out each and every Tuesday. Now let's get to Andrey. Andrey, good to see you again. For those that might not be familiar, we've talked a couple of times before. What do you do?
Hello, Paul. I run a company called Sovicon, and we issue a service, a report called Sizov Report. The report covers our main focus is wheat and Black Sea specifically, because we know a lot about this region. I'm originally from Russia, originally from that region. We have a lot of people on the ground in that region, good connections all over the region. And we know, and people who trade grain and wheat specifically know that it could be pretty important often for global grain markets. So we'll look at this region and help people to understand what's happening here. And could it drive Chicago limit up or limit down because of some developments on the ground here?
Your position, or your geographic location. You don't sound like you're in Tennessee. You're not you're not in North America, but you
No.
talk about Chicago like you pay attention to it. Why do you pay attention to Chicago in Europe?
So, because that's still a major benchmark for majority of agricultural commodities, wheat included, of course. There are a lot of questions about how it works and how is there really a good benchmark for physical market for actual fundamentals, but it's still the most liquid contract if you talk about Chicago wheat, CBOT wheat, and that's why we have to follow it closely. So it's number one ticker on my screen, that Chicago wheat, then Matif, which you guys in the US follow to less extent, but it's also pretty important, especially for the Black Sea, which is often traded versus Matif, and then Kansas wheat. A lot of people say that Kansas wheat is kind of less speculative contract, but again, Chicago is the most liquid one. That's why we have to follow it closely. And we do know that it does react often and sometimes very rapidly and very strong to developments here in Europe or in the Black Sea.
But to me, that's very interesting that all of you follow Chicago, but the wheat market is much more in recent times dependent on what happens in your area.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and that's a good question. I agree. So, for example, in my view, hypothetically, Matif wheat, which is traded in Paris, should be a better benchmark because whole Europe is traded versus Matif. Whole Black Sea is traded versus Matif, first of all. But the problem with Matif, it's not as liquid as Chicago. So, the irony, for example, in recent months, we saw, for example, Chicago going down because of stronger dollar, which actually should support Paris because of weaker euro at the same time. But in reality, the Paris motif wheat was following Chicago, which doesn't make sense fundamentally, but this is how it has been working in recent months. And that's strange, yeah, I agree. And actually, if I were a Euronext, that exchange which trades motif, probably I should invest more efforts to make it more liquid, to improve liquidity, improve options, but they don't do that, and that's why CBOT remains the number one benchmark, despite the fact that the US is very far from being an exporter number one at the moment of wheat.
And hasn't been for years and years.
Yeah. Now, just to give you an idea, so we're all talking metric tons, but Russia probably would, our estimate, would export around 42 million tons of wheat this season. And it's not the highest number, which is more than 50% higher than the US. Then you have Ukraine, then you have the EU, and combined, they export roughly 3 times at least than the US. But despite that, Chicago is still number one benchmark for wheat market globally.
All right, so the benchmark, Chicago, got it. All right, but it's still watching your region. Let's talk about your region then. Let's start with Black Sea. What's the latest on? Let's just start scope of influence and Russia versus Ukraine. Are those still the biggest two storylines out of that area?
So let's just say a few words, as you suggested, about Russia and Ukraine importance for grain markets. So for wheat, it's Russia is still by far number one exporter of wheat, and it has been like that for several years already. Russia and Ukraine export combined around 60 million tons of wheat per year. This season, that would be a volume for this season. And that's roughly 1/3 of total wheat exports. And so that's the biggest wheat exporting hub by far in the world. If we talk about corn, Russia ships negligible volumes, a few millions this year. Ukraine is the biggest supplier, but it's still typically number 4 after US, Brazil, Argentina, and then comes Ukraine. So, but it's very important for wheat and still relatively important for global corn markets, especially taking account that Ukraine has been used to be the number one supplier of corn to China, and we all know how important China is for the US exports, corn exports. Right now, if you want to talk about recent developments, let's talk about recent developments, or just what do you want to talk about?
I do have a question. Let's go Ukraine specifically. A couple of weeks ago on the TV show, Ted Seifert said that what he's hearing about Ukraine is that they're not planting as many acres. And if the war would end, if there would be some end, they might go back to increasing acres, just in general, not just wheat, but everything. Are you hearing that there's less acres still not in production here in the last 3 to 4 years than historic? For whatever reason, and what is that reason?
Yes, so there's obviously a substantial decline in acreage in Ukraine for all crops after the start of the war, which now we're talking about it started in February 2022, so it's almost 3 years ago. But Russia captured around 20% of Ukrainian territory, including some agricultural regions in southeastern part of the country. But because of that, they're planting less because they control less territory. But at the same time, if we look at planting area acreage in 22, 23, 24, and estimates for 25, there is no decline, I think. Actually, if we talk about winter wheat, for example, because it has been planted for the next season already, it's basically unchanged year on year. We see some decline in corn area, for example, but it's being offset by bigger area under oil seeds because of higher margins. But, it's relatively stable. So it was a huge decline, huge drop after 2022 because of the start of the war. But after that, it has been relatively flat. And we see some changes because of just different margins for different crops. For Russia and for Ukraine, typically, for the US, it's kind of that relation between corn and beans. But I think for Russia and Ukraine, for Russia, it's sunflower seed versus wheat. And for Ukraine, it could be sunflower seeds versus wheat or versus corn. So there are some adjustment, more corn, less oil seeds, or more oil seeds, less corn. I think we'll see that next season. But if you look at total acreage, it's more or less flat.
Okay, so it's a shifting in the total acreage. So what is, from that initial drop 3 years ago, of the acres not being planted, what's sitting there?
That territory is currently under Russian control. As I said, it's around 20% of Ukraine total territory. So it's mainly Donetsk, Lugansk, those regions in southeastern Ukraine. And they still produce some crops there. And actually, it's quite an interesting part of global supply and demand balance. Not the biggest one. It's not obviously Brazil or US or Russian wheat production, things like that. But it's still an important variable, I think, for global supply and demand balance sheet because it's on the radar of almost everyone. Because we know the grain being produced on that territory, that grain is not being reflected in any Ukrainian supply-demand balance sheet because it's not controlled by Ukraine. And it's at the same time, it's not properly reflected in Russian supply and demand balance sheet because, it's not politically... no one says that it's Russia, and even in Russian statistics, they don't reflect those numbers, or sometimes they do reflect, but there's a line. Here's the production old Russia, and here's the production in Russia. It's called new regions, and here's the production in new regions. But majority of analysts don't reflect those numbers in Russian crop numbers as well. So there's probably around 4 to 6 million tons of production, and part of that being exported, which is not reflected anywhere. It's not reflected in Ukrainian numbers. It's not reflected in Russian numbers, but still some volume, which is being produced there.
Yeah, that's what I wanted you to say out loud, because that's the way it sounded, is that, Russia is hard to know exactly what's going on. It's a little bit like China. We know things are happening there. We just don't know exact numbers like what we know in the United States, what we know in Canada and Mexico to an extent on the world stage. And so you're just making sure that's still what's going on.
Yeah, and that's what we do, and that's why we are not doing so bad. I mean, our business, because we have a good understanding what's happening here on the ground, and so what does the crop look like, what exports look like. And if you've been talking about recent developments, I think that's a substantial story, because yesterday we had a WASDE report from the USDA. And again, they keep overestimating Russian exports. And if they are too high, in our views, they are very high. Still, that number, 2-3 millions above the reasonable volume, above our estimates. If there is a gap in wheat supply this season, that gap should be filled by other suppliers. That could be Argentina, that could be Australia, and that could be US. And that could be a big story for Chicago if we see higher US wheat exports and smaller carry-out stocks for the US, which should help US wheat prices.
The Russian side of this story, let's focus there for just a moment. Are they holding their grain to put onto the market for a higher price, or are they just kind of selling it to, the theory is, funding it to keep their war operations going? Is that accurate?
So are they keeping for higher price, or
like a farmer in the United States holds their grain until they see the higher price. Whatever the price is, they will hold until they get a higher price. Is Russia just putting that on the market basically as soon as they take that grain in to have some type of steady income to fund their operations?
You mean fund operation? I think I get a question. So is it about how important grain exports for the government, how important for state revenue? Yes? Did I get a question right?
Yeah.
Okay. So, that's kind of I think that's a misconception because, yes, we hear that Russia sells a lot of wheat at whatever price to fund the war, and it's very far from being accurate in our view. So for just a few numbers, Russian oil and gas revenue, state revenue, budget revenue is more than $100 billion of export taxes for oil and gas. For grains and all crops, I think it's around $1 billion. So 1% compared to energy revenue. So it's not a big deal, and I don't think that's really an important story for Russian government, let's put it that way. So there are, if we talk about this season specifically, because there are different dynamics, and 2 years ago, 3 years ago, it was another story this season. So the problem is for Russian farmers, and that's a big problem, and it's not related to the war. It's related to the fact that in 2021, before the war, Russia introduced very strict export taxes on majority of crops which are being produced there, including wheat, corn, barley, sunflower, almost all oil seeds. And that's why farmers' margins have been collapsing in recent years in Russia. So farmers, yes, they would prefer in many cases to store their crops for longer periods of time to sell it later. But the reality is, because of low margins and low financial reserves, they have to sell it faster than usual. And I think that was the case for this season, especially for the first half of the season, which started in July, if you talk about wheat. And Russian farmers were selling a lot, Russian exporters were selling a lot, and despite a substantially smaller crop, Russian wheat exports are still, its pace is record high, despite small supply, because of very aggressive exports in the first half of the season. But the point is, now this story is mostly over. Grain supplies are substantially down inside the country. Domestic prices are rising fast. And that's why we see a substantial slowdown in Russian exports. For example, in February, Russian wheat exports are likely to decline around 50% year on year. And not because of weak demand, probably weak demand is also part of the story, but I think the major reason is just small supply of sun inside the country.
And the reason for the smaller supply, you may have said it, is it because the crop wasn't as good?
Yeah, because the crop wasn't good. So basically, I think, just again to give you an idea, 2022, Russia had a great weather and harvested record high wheat crop, 102 million tons. Then a year later, 23, it was 92 million tons, minus 10 million tons. Last year, it was another minus 10 million tons, 82. 100, 90, 80, and for next year, we expect to see a further decline below 80. It won't be 70 probably, but below 80 million tons compared to 100 million tons in 2022. The part of explanation is weather problems, but another explanation, which I mentioned briefly, that farmers are struggling, they're not making money because of very high export taxes. Just to give an idea how much taxes are put in, how much they're taking out of the farmer pocket, it's roughly around, depending on the region, from 20 to 40% out of their total sales. Not their profits, but sales. So it's very restrictive, and that's why farmers are not making a lot of money, and that's why one of the reasons why we see such a decline in production of wheat and actually other crops in Russia.
Is there anything that's going to change that? Lowering of the export tax, is that one way that it would help the Russian farmer? I mean, you can't, in the United States, we always talk about growing your way out of a problem. I mean, that's not the whole issue. It sounds like the tax issue is really a major thing there.
Yeah, exactly. So for Ukraine, the major issue for Ukrainian farming industry obviously is the war. And actually, we should add that it was way more resilient than many expected at the start of the war. But for Russia, it's not related to the war. It's related to the fact that 4 years ago already, Russia started to introduce very restrictive export taxes, and they are still in place. They have been somewhat low, but they're still in place, and that cost the Russian farmer a lot. And until there is until they're lifted, and I don't think that's happening near time soon, Russian crop production is likely to decline further. So probably if we talk in a year or two, I won't be surprised to say I don't rule out that I will be saying that Russia now is not number one wheat exporter.
Does that open the door? Well, okay. Is Russia going to have to import wheat?
No, not at this stage, but
I didn't think so, but I just wanted to make sure I asked.
Yeah. But it's a valid question. I mean, if we look at 30, 40 years ago, Russia and USSR was very popular among farmers around the world because it was the biggest grain importer in the world. So can we get back to that? It's unlikely during the next several years at least. But I mean, if nothing won't be changed, I hope, and it should be changed sooner or later. But if nothing is changed, I don't rule out then when there is a poor crop, I know in 5-10 years, Russia could import some noticeable volumes of grain from other countries.
Does the Chicago Board of Trade know all this? Do you think the price is factored into wheat specifically, and has that spilled over into corn and soybeans through the board?
So we do watch wheat market closely on day-to-day basis. We can say that so all the problems we have in Russia and the outlook for the next crop is not good. There are other problems with wheat crop, particularly in the US, because of the cold snap you had in just recent weeks. So the outlook for production in Northern Hemisphere is not great. We have problems very likely in Russia because plants entered the winter in a very weak shape. And at the same time, we feel the physical market, particularly in Northern Africa, which is the biggest probably combined buyer of wheat, we see some recovery in demand there. And I suspect that there is a change of sentiment in the market because before, I think, 2025, the market was just selling wheat. All wheat rallies were sold. All spikes were sold. Just sell wheat and make money. That was the approach. But I think it's changing right now because of the problems I mentioned as part of the story. And sentiment is changing. For example, I think last week, for example, just to illustrate that idea, last week, for example, US wheat inspections were extremely weak a week ago, while the Chicago wheat rallied at the same day. I mean, just ignored those weak numbers, and it means changed sentiment. So all news in the past were bearish news, and now is either neutral or actually bullish. And of course, a lot will depend what will happen between Russia and Ukraine, how successful Trump administration would be in the attempts to end this conflict.
Right, and that's always one of those stories that we hear about of, well, we're going to end this. Well, it's not your war, but we've been involved in it in the United States with funding of things, and there's not an appetite right now to put as much money there as there once was, and I'm sure everybody knows that around the world. They can read the papers too.
Yeah. But so if you look at outlook, and I think we, at the very beginning, we spoke how important that region is for global grain trade and specifically wheat market. And I think actually one of the reasons, if we look at second half of 2024, one of the reasons for wheat weakness was that the market was expecting higher Donald Trump odds than he was elected, and the market was expecting that he would stop this war and that would somehow help production and exports out of the region, which is bearish. And for example, if you look at the market right now, if you look at Ukrainian debt, their bonds, they have been running since October. They grew by around 50%, something like that. It's a very strong rally. So holders of their debt believe that Ukraine will be able to pay them back. And that's optimistic. And just yesterday, or this night, an American citizen was freed by the Kremlin. Trump's envoy flew to Russia, an expected visit, and flew back to the US with an American citizen. And that really could be indicating that odds of truce, at least a truce or some agreement here, they are higher. But at the same time, I just want to say my point is kind of contrarian in this case. But at the same time, I think that has been any success, he has been already priced in or almost priced in. And at the same time, it's very far from being guaranteed, despite the energies that the new administration is investing and all their efforts. I think it's far from being guaranteed. So if there's no truce, if there's no peace agreement, we could see another wave of escalation. And that could be a quite bullish story in my view, for wheat, first of all.
It's not that I am looking for the contrarian opinion. I just appreciate it. It's always good to hear something different than what I hear on a day-to-day basis. So, Andrey, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Let's, if we could, expand the reach just a tiny little bit to China. What type of look do you have what goes on over there and how it influences your customers and clients? And what do you see from where you're at in China's response to the United States? Kind of like what you were just talking about, Russia's response and Ukraine's response to the U.S. and Trump.
So if we talk about the war in the Black Sea, China has been promoting it. It had its own peace plan a long time ago. I think it was introduced and it was supported by Brazil. So China tries to be kind of a representative of global South, we can put it that way, in this conflict. And China says that it wants to end this war. And they invest some efforts into ending this war. For example, it was just interesting that they supported Trump's statements about the end of this war. They said, okay, we want to work with President Trump, we want to work with Russia and Ukraine to end this war. And I don't think China actually has been kind of probably beneficiaries of some kind of this war, but it feels that now they really don't want it to continue, at least at this stage. I think they want a strong global economic growth, and obviously that war is one of the problems for that growth.
Okay. Do you see China, can you give any perspective to the United States and China's relationship from where you're at? Not necessarily you're an independent person, but you're removed from the two sides. And
Yeah.
Are you seeing any thawing or freezing of relations between the two?
Yeah, obviously, President Trump was talking a lot about China, and it was a very important topic for him during his first term. And actually, I was a bit surprised that he spent so much time on tariffs. We have tariffs news almost every day, coming from the White House. I thought it's going to be easier similar to what we saw during his previous term, because there was a lot of talk about China and he became president in early 2017, but actually first tariffs against China were introduced only in 2018, more than a year later. But it's not the case this time, because there was already tariffs on Chinese exports to the US, 10% tariffs. And I think that it's not right now. It's not developing well for both countries, because contrary to those one-day tariffs against Mexico and Canada, those 10% tariffs against China are still in place. China replied with some tariffs on the US. And it was then, I think one of the Trump advisors said that President Trump and Xi would speak shortly, I think on February 4, and that call didn't happen. And I think that trade war is far from being over, and that is bad news for farmers across the world, because China is obviously a big importer of crops, US included. And I see for now, I see more escalation ahead, because China definitely is not going to just to say, okay, we give up. similar to what Mexico and Canada did. Because China, I think they were preparing for this war for some time, and they had a plan what they will do after the Trump's next moves. And this war is not over, and I think it could continue for some time.
It's interesting you talk about that phone call that didn't happen, because there was a couple of stories written about how phone calls had or had not happened between the two countries over the years and what that signaled. So that is interesting that you talked about that is still being viewed by others and not just those who are either trying to make news or trying to figure out if that's making news.
Yeah. And just to give you an example why it's a problem, it could be a problem right now for this season, but it's likely to have longer term consequences. Because, for example, now, as all US farmers know, China began to buy a lot of Brazilian crops, soybeans, corn, and all of that started after the trade war of 2018. So all those consequences after that, China swiftly approved Brazil's supply, because typically it could take up to 10 years to get access to Chinese market. And that was done very swiftly after that trade war. And now Brazil is number one supplier of many crops to China. And so, and that's why it's likely to have not consequences just only this year. And we see a relatively weak Chinese inputs, but not only because of war, but because probably of different balance sheet. But it's likely to have longer-term political consequences. One of them, China would welcome more supplies in addition to Brazil, for example. And another one, I think it's a longer-term story if we talk about China, but it makes sense to mention it, that China is clearly trying to boost its own production of all major crops. If we just look at headlines, at news for 24, 25, they're approving new, for example, corn varieties. They invest a lot in agri-technologies. They bought, probably it won't be possible at this time, but I think it was the biggest direct investment of China 5-7 years ago. They bought Syngenta. It was a Swiss company and is one of the leaders, top producers, top scientific investors in R&D, in seeds and crop protection. It was Swiss company at that time, and now it's Chinese. So it looks like a kind of long-term plan, which should lead to the fact that China would produce more. And at the same time, you have a flat population, slightly declining population, which is getting older, which means that they're likely to consume less meat per capita, which means that demand is likely to shrink, while the domestic production is likely to grow, which is actually bad news for all farmers around the world, because China probably in 10 years won't be importing 100 million tons of soybeans like they're importing now.
Which then puts Brazil's crop on the market at more supply, because they don't seem to be shrinking acres in their production, or they keep putting a whole lot into the hopper and into the bins, which means there'll be less demand for it, less demand for the U.S. crop globally if China takes care of themselves. So yeah, that has huge reverberations that we have to watch out. Let's close with this, exactly. Andrey. Biggest 2 to 3 stories that we're going to watch here in the next 3 months, 4 months globally when it comes to grains. We've kind of, is it different than what we've talked about, Russia and Ukraine and China? Are there other headlines or big stories that we need to kind of just make sure we're watching to see what happens?
Yeah, I think we had a good discussion and probably covered those stories, but let's just summarize and repeat them once again. So, and probably I should also just say a few words as an analyst, that fundamentally wheat has been very cheap and is still very cheap. If you look at stocks to use, all those basic indicators, corn is also relatively cheap, but not as cheap as wheat, which global supply and demand balance sheet is tighter than corn, and it shouldn't cost $5.5 per bushel or $5.8 per bushel like right now. So we believe there is upside in wheat prices, and the question is what could be the trigger. And the trigger, we could talk about that. So it's relatively bad weather in the northern hemisphere. We have big problems in Russia, and they're likely to continue because fortunately didn't have any serious cold, so the winter kill will be limited. But at the same time, there's lack of snow, which means there won't be enough soil moisture in the spring for spring vegetation. Ukraine and the US, Ukraine and Europe, they look more or less okay if you talk about wheat production. And then we have substantial problems in the US because we had a cold snap in Kansas several weeks ago, and probably it had some winter kill. So the supply is likely we could have some problems with supply quite shortly. Another region we are closely watching is India and Pakistan. Just let's jump to another part of the world. In Northern Hemisphere, it's very dry. It has been very dry. It's likely to remain dry during the February. And if you follow wheat market, you've been hearing the story about Indian wheat inputs for a long time, and they didn't happen for many years. But things could change this season or in 2025. First of all, for Pakistan, which has very big problems with its own wheat crop and still a very big country, and India obviously is a very big country. We could see some inputs there, small crop and some inputs, first of all, from Pakistan, which is also could be a bullish story. At the same time, probably good crop in southern hemisphere is priced in, but I'm not sure about Australia, where the crop could be bigger than was expected earlier. It could that could be a bearish story, and probably number one story for next weeks or maybe months, and I'm afraid could be for the whole 2025 is Russian-Ukrainian war, because as I mentioned, a lot of efforts a lot of time being invested in solving this conflict, and I think the negotiations they're actually going on now. It's confirmed officially, but as I mentioned, it's guarantee of any long-term agreement, long-term truce, unfortunately, is very far from 100%, and that in turn could lead to another wave of escalation. And that could be a catalyst for a rally in wheat prices.
I know we joked before we started rolling that we could talk for 24 hours, and really, Andrey, we could.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on. So I appreciate you giving us, the latest report on kind of what's happening in there, and I certainly appreciate your expanding us on the perspective that you have of that market. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for watching this MTOM podcast. New episodes, subscribe and like so you don't miss when they come out each and every Tuesday.